BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. So, I was trying to find a documentary about just how the human brain functions, and I came across one on YouTube simply called The Human Brain, and it turned out they were actually going to be talking about serial killers in it for one segment. I didn't even know that when I watched the thing, but they used three specific case examples: Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and Joel Rifkin. Now, what I would say about this is, I'm not some type of psychologist, or I'm not a doctor or anything. I'm very clear about those things. But we have been talking about these subjects for a while. We covered Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer this year with multiple uploads. We haven't done a specific upload on Joel Rifkin, but we have mentioned him many times on the channel. Now, they said some very interesting things about what could drive certain people to kill and what would drive people not to kill. And I think that's one of the greatest mysteries that people have when they're exploring this subject, not only about serial killers, but just about murder in general. Like, what really pushes a human being to commit these types of actions? So, there were three pieces of information that this documentary, The Human Brain, revealed, and that, I found rather interesting as a total outsider to the field, and I've never heard them in any other source. But what they said was, very clearly, that first and foremost, the part of the brain called the amygdala that deals with emotional regulation and affects emotions, right? A psychopath has an amygdala that is 17 times smaller, like 17 times smaller than that of a normal person. And, that just, absolutely, that made sense to me, because think about all the things we've talked about: not having a conscience, not being able to process empathy, all of those things. And then the next thing that we would look at is the amygdala is not necessarily connected to the frontal lobes. Like, there isn't a very good level of communication on the neurological level. We're talking about the neurotransmitters and such and how they function from the amygdala to the frontal lobe of the brain, where you're going to be dealing with things like anticipation and decision making, where you're going to be dealing with things like advanced calculations and such. So, that also, when you think about it in that respect, it's like, well, so you have someone who is very good at functioning, but the emotions and the feeling just aren't really connected, and the emotional and feeling center is much smaller. That was just kind of my takeaway from it. The third thing that they stated in this film was that there is about 1% of the population that is psychopathic. 1%, like 1 out of every 100. And, that is the thing that I found a little bit more mind-blowing, for lack of a better term, because it's like 1% of the population is psychopathic, but not all psychopaths go on to become Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer or Joel Rifkin. Not all psychopaths end up becoming violent, but 1% of the population does have these psychopathic issues. Okay, though, so what do we make of some of these things? Well, what I can say about all of these three guys, Rifkin, Bundy, Dahmer, they all are very antisocial personalities. And people called me out on the John Hughes upload on this channel saying, I shouldn't be using the word antisocial, but they were talking about it more in kind of the commonly perceived definition, like they don't like to socialize, or they don't like to be extroverted or something, or they don't like to have social interaction. No, so I mean that in the more high school health class textbook definition. When I say antisocial, I simply mean against the social norm. And absolutely, look at somebody like Ted Bundy, look at all of his deviant behavior. Stealing and shoplifting, public masturbation, loads of things. Jeffrey Dahmer's spending loads of time in the woods in that little shed, dissecting animals for fun. Even those things are against the social norm. And with Joel Rifkin, he's kind of a peculiar case. I'm not an expert on him, but some of the things that they really point to that could have driven Joel Rifkin to commit his atrocities were that he was bullied severely in school, and bullying was actually something that kind of allowed him to have somewhat of a neurological break. But, some people, though, say, well, it's not simply that some people say this. It's just one of the things that they were putting forward is one of the reasons why the amygdala and the frontal lobes might not be completely connected with some people is that it happens in the womb. psychopath meaning that you're born with it, sociopath meaning that society or the social environment has caused the person to function this way. So, I mean, I think that that's rather eye-opening. Some people are probably just born to become a psychopath, and the violent tendencies could be the result of going through a lot of abuse or just developing antisocial tendencies because of a lack of bonding with their parents, as well as things like being betrayed by the parents as well, what we call the shattering of the pillars of childhood. We mentioned that on this channel frequently. But when you're actually going to be looking at these three guys, I think there's a little bit more to it than one of the presenters in the film. And this is actually something that aired on the History Channel. I only know that because of the logo in the corner. It's like an episode, I guess you'd say. But there's this guy in there who's talking about how I don't stab somebody with a knife because I can feel what you're feeling. It's like, I'll feel it too. I can feel that you feel somebody's suffering and you feel somebody's emotional pain and such. And this is why the average person doesn't stab somebody with a knife and murder somebody. But I think, though, that maybe you could make that case when you're dealing with the serial killers, when you're dealing with Joel Rifkin and Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer. Perhaps you could say that, but it's now December, and if to the people who have been following the show for a while, you'll remember during the summer I couldn't stop talking about Forensic Files and 48 Hours. I was following those things every day, and most of the stuff that I found on Forensic Files was not coming from people like Bundy, Dahmer, and Rifkin. It was coming from people who were more involved with things like murdering their spouse for the insurance money, trying to poison their business partner, or going after someone in like a secluded area or a fight kicks off and this is what happens. Some guy beats somebody to death with a beer bottle and things like that. It's like they were more dealing with the average person was trying to do something because they thought they were going to get away with it. If I could just pull out, the Forensic Files Rolodex and be like, let's just go through it. How many times do we see that someone is murdering someone because they think they're going to get away with it, and they think that they are above the law, they think that they've outsmarted everyone, and you see this really with the people who are someone who commits like one murder, and just they think that their plan is just so brilliant that they won't get caught. I really thought about this with the case of Kristen Rossum. We did an upload called The American Beauty Murder Story, where you have a toxicologist who poisoned her husband, and it's like, well, obviously she was going to get caught. She used the poisons from her own toxicology lab. I mean, you really just see, though, this type of arrogance and egoism that really fuels people. And granted, though, most of the things on Forensic Files that we were just describing were things like stab wounds. And I even remember back in a class I took once, the professor was just sort of saying that many people choose to murder with handguns because it just kind of creates more of that emotional barrier where it's like they don't feel the knife going into the person, so like they're more emotionally disconnected. So to kind of give a bit of counterbalance to that statement that I was very critical of about the reason why the average person doesn't stab someone is because they'll feel it too, yeah, there could be a certain sense of truth to that, but I do have to insist, a lot of people just throw their empathy out the window. They just get rid of all the empathetic connection to other people when they feel like they are not going to get caught. They want to kill their spouse and get the insurance policy money. And I really think, though, after going through many of those episodes of Forensic Files in 48 Hours, a lot of that is really centered on egoism. They just think that they are so brilliant that they can outsmart everyone and that they're not going to get caught with this murder. Greed, selfishness, and trying to think that they are above the rest of the population. But when you look at people like Joel Rifkin and Ted Bundy that they were talking about, Ted Bundy had an IQ of 136. They said in this one that Joel Rifkin had an IQ of 128. I had never heard of that. I didn't know that particular statistic about him before, but another thing that I believe they said is that only 3% of the population has an IQ of 128 or higher. I hope I'm quoting that one correctly, so I mean, that's probably best not to go around and throw that statistic around. Maybe I'll bring it up next time I want to embarrass myself at a cocktail party and such. But the thing is, though, you really see with somebody like Ted Bundy, he really thought that he was like a master persuader, but I don't know about you guys. Whenever I see interviews with Ted Bundy or something, once you know the truth, once you know that he is a serial killer and he is this kind of, well, for lack of a better term, I don't like using this term too frequently, he is practically a monster, then you see how fake it is. You just see like this is just a total like veneer. It is just like it's fake. It's artificial. His personality, the charm, you can just see right through it and be like, okay, you're actually just kind of a slimy guy. I mean, I don't know how anybody. Richard Ramirez would be another person. Like, I don't know how he's able to fool and persuade anyone when he's being so blatantly fake. I mean, like, somebody like Ted Bundy, he murdered over 30 people, and those are only the ones that we know about. So it's like, I just don't feel it very convincing. You can really think of it like being a politician, like Ted Bundy was involved with politics, and he seems like a fake politician who's just gonna lie and lie to try and cut his way to the top. But what did I say in the past, though? Like, I hope I'm getting this right. We talked about it during the Ted Bundy upload. Ted Bundy was a Republican, and he was involved with Republican politics, and before you ever trash the Republican Party, John Wayne Gacy was a Democrat, and John Wayne Gacy was involved with Democratic politics. Hey, both sides have their problems, it's like one apiece. You can have them, balance it out. And I don't really mean to be too humorous about something like that, but when it comes to some guy, though, like John Wayne Gacy, I mean, you can watch the interviews with him. He seems, though, like he is just a little bit less of the Ted Bundy type, where he thinks that he can just charm everybody with his personality and his brightness. But the big difference between Ted Bundy and guys like Gacy and Dahmer is that Gacy and Dahmer were psychopathic torture murderers, where they really wanted to torture the person to death. I mean, yes, they were very sexually motivated, but they really wanted to torture the person to death. And we had a good comment come in once about John Wayne Gacy saying that John Wayne Gacy was a bisexual, and one of the reasons why his victims were male could have been that he was very ashamed of his homosexuality, and he wanted to kind of export the cycle of destructive behaviors onto his victims. I had brought up in that particular upload that John Wayne Gacy also never had the approval of his father, and his father used to beat him with a leather strap relentlessly, not even acknowledging how much pain he was inflicting on both of his children, onto John Wayne Gacy and to his sister. So I think it's all of the above, and that's normally what you find in serial killer cases and a lot of true crime cases. The answer is just all of the above, especially with the serial killers and the motivations about why people commit these crimes. It's every nasty thing that you can think of happened, as well as biology. Like some of these things, like I'm tempted to use the words biological determinism, but no, they're really saying that some people are born with this type of brain function that is allowing them to just have no real connections and balances and emotion, and no sort of connection between the emotional sphere, which is very small, and the decision-making and calculating actions that they are going to be experiencing in life. But to kind of deviate from that, one of the other things that we've talked about on this channel was the manosphere, and we're going to be doing another upload about that very shortly. But a thing to kind of discuss with this one is that there are different ways that people recreate the cycle of destructive behaviors. Some people recreate the cycle of destructive behaviors within themselves. These would be like the addicts, the alcoholics, the promiscuous types. They do destructive things to their own body. Other people recreate the cycle of destructive behaviors by exporting the abuse outward onto other people, and that's what you really find with a lot of the people, such as that we've been talking about in this upload. Definitely, the serial killers are people who've most likely been through some form of abuse, traumatization, like dealing with very, very severe unhealed childhood traumas, or just feeling rejected from society, and then they want to export that one outward. And we brought up that quote that I didn't even know where it was from. Somebody just left it on a different true crime upload on someone else's channel, when they said, "The child who was neglected from society will burn down the village to feel its warmth." So it's like the outcast will burn down the village to feel its warmth. And I mean, that's definitely something that seems to be going on with a lot of these people. Perhaps everyone that we've described so far, Gacy, Dahmer, Bundy, Rifkin, and perhaps some other people would also come to mind, where it's like this is what they believe that it's just the only thing that they can do. And we used to talk about the expression of kind of striving toward what they want in life. They're trying to strive toward acceptance and approval, but then they feel they are not worthy of it, so then they'll deviate from the path and then just destroy things, hence recreating the cycle of destructive behaviors, as opposed to striving toward this ideal thing that they've actually recognized as a form of goodness. Because, so says me anyway, in my own sort of kind of non-professional viewpoint on the subject. But, you really see that the cycles of destructive behavior can be very big or they can be very small. People who have been abused or feel rejected from society and they go on to become serial killers or mass shooters, they're individuals who are very extreme cases. Very extreme. I think that there are going to be much smaller examples of this, and this is what we're going to talk about in the future upload that I mentioned, about how some people are the victims of bullying, like the way Joel Rifkin was, but instead of becoming a serial killer, instead of becoming some kind of horrendous individual the way Rifkin did, they would do it to a lighter extent. They're the victim of bullying, so then anytime someone comes into their life, they're just going to start bullying the person. Instead of be like, oh wow, now I have good friends in my life. No, instead they're going to start bullying any friend that comes near them. Why? Because, well, that's first and foremost something that is very familiar to them. Secondarily, that is more about they view that as a form of power and a form of strength, and then like, okay, this is how you get to the top of the dominance hierarchy. You become the bully yourself, and then they're just going to start once again exporting the negativity and the violence and the destructive behavior onto another person, and that person is probably also somewhat fragmented. And if we're going to talk about unhealed childhood traumas and mention somebody like Joel Rifkin, then a lot of people are probably dealing with that on a much smaller scale, because once again, only 1% of the population is going to be psychopathic, but not everyone in that 1% is even going to be violent, so says this film that I was watching. But I would say, though, that I was very surprised that they didn't make any differentiation between psychopaths and sociopaths, very specifically with the definitions that we kind of talked about at the beginning. So I'm not really sure if they're including people who would have sociopathic tendencies in that 1% number. That could be something else that we could look up in the future. But the whole point is, life is nasty. There are a lot of abusive things that go on in life, and it is a very kind of dark and twisted spiral. The only thing I would say about that is, while I am an outsider to, like medicine and psychology, right? I think you probably have too. You've probably met a few assholes in your life growing up, and maybe you can think about how they function and how they operated. And you've probably also had toxic people in your life, and you can think about how they behaved once they had somebody close to them. Oh, well, they're just like, well, now I have a good person in my life, so I can be, everything is fine. Or did they kind of recreate the cycle of destructive behaviors and force it onto another person? Once again, not everybody does that. Some people put the destruction onto themselves, and they'll turn to things like addiction or risky behavior, if for lack of a better term. But I think that's where we're going to have to conclude our discussion now. This is just some things that I had been kind of watching about how the serial killer brain functions, as well as just some things on antisocial behavior, meaning against the social norm. And I would love to hear anything that you guys have to say. If you like this upload, you can hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed yet, you can subscribe. Feel free to do so. And we can continue our discussions about some of these things with psychology and serial killers, true crime, all of that. We're going to get back to the Zodiac Killer very soon. But I would really like to hear from you guys and what you think about the subject, because this is something that is, as someone who's just watching the material, you begin to notice these patterns and trends and similarities, and you're like, hey, now wait a second, we also saw this with this person, we also experienced this with, this case, and definitely when it comes to dealing with toxic personalities, who hasn't had somebody like that in their life from time to time? So I would really like to know many things about what you have to say on this one, and if you disagree with anything that I put forward, please, let's challenge it in the comment section. That's all from me. Until next time.